How's it going, everyone? I'm very excited to show you CinePrint16 version 2. It includes a ton of incremental improvements that I've made to improve the accuracy, appearance, and workflow of the film emulation. Existing users will receive an email on how to update, and for those of you who are new, you can check out the link below for more info. Now let's jump into Resolve. Alright, here we are in Resolve. I've got a variety of clips here, and I'm just going to walk through them and talk about some of the new features of version 2. So I will apply the PowerGrade here, and right off the bat it's going to look a little strange because we need to make sure we are using our correct color space transform. This is already Alexa footage in log C, so we don't need the CST and we can just disable it. And here you can see the starting point of version 2 is pretty flat, so we will increase our contrast. But before we do that, let me just turn on denoising real quick, and then we can increase our contrast here. And for this clip, I'm just gonna go through just all the adjustments, and then I'll talk a little more in depth about some of the specific features in these later clips. One thing that I like to do on a lot of clips, especially if you're noticing a lot of hue variance in the skin tone, especially towards magenta, is turn on the lab hue adjustment. So if I turn that on and off, you can see what that's doing in the vector scope down here. It's doing a rotation and also a bit of compression on our hues, especially along the magenta and green axis. So when you turn that on, if I enlarge this, you can see how much of the blue channel it's pulling out of his skin tone. And then on something like this car headrest, it's pulling out some of those greens and yellows. It also affects those green trees in the background. Very subtle, but it's there. And if it was affecting any hues you didn't want it to affect, you could just take those out with the qualifier, but in this case I'm fine with it affecting the whole image, and I will leave that on. Now from here I'll probably change our contrast just a little bit more, maybe lower our exposure slightly, and then we can enlarge our image. Probably we'll also take out a little more saturation. We don't want it to feel too oversaturated. And then I'll go to our white balance and make some slight tweaks here. And I'll talk about this new white balancing method in some later clips, but I'd say we're starting to look pretty good here. Maybe I'll go and decrease our grain slightly just because we've increased our post contrast a decent amount. Let's compare this to our Rec 709 image, which is just a CST. We've got denoising and CST going from log C to 709. So if we compare here, you can see a lot of the main characteristics of the emulation, like the halation happening here in the upper stops of the dynamic range. We've got it appearing on his arm, on the shirt, around his head, and then around these car windows, and even also in the headrest here, some of those reflective areas. We can also see how the skin tone is being affected. We've got those nice subtractive reds and just general richness and liveliness to the skin tone that is very characteristic of film. So I'd say this is a pretty decent final look for our Cineon output. Now if we switch to our print output, we can do a slightly different look. The print is going to be a little bit more contrasty, so I'll probably lower our pre-contrast here to open up the shadows a bit. It also tends to be slightly more magenta, so I'm going to change our tint a little bit. Maybe I'll warm it up too, because I don't want it to feel too cool. So maybe something like this, and then maybe we can push our post contrast just a tad bit more, and then let's look at that. Maybe we'll also increase exposure just slightly there. And now let's compare to our Rec 709. So this is looking pretty good. We've just got a very classic print look with that warm and cool color separation happening here. And I'd say this is good for a final look. So let's move on to our next clip. Okay, so this clip is also Alexa footage. So we can just copy the grade over, and I'll switch to our Cineon output. And this clip is a good opportunity to talk about the new white balancing technique. So previously with the old version of CinePrint, it was just using the offset wheel, but now in version 2, it is using the chromatic adaptation plugin, which is just a built-in native plugin to the Resolve effects library. And this uses the same color science and math as the new HDR wheels in Resolve 17. Both of them are color space aware. And the way they work is they take the input color space and convert to LMS color space, which is based on the cone response of the human eye. So this helps make your white balance adjustments more photometrically accurate, and it just makes white balancing easier overall and gives you better results. It's a lot better than the offset wheel, which is just making linear changes to the RGB channels. So I'll pull down the color temp here to demonstrate, and you can see how clean that adjustment is. I'll probably leave it somewhere around here, and then just pull back our tint slightly, and then from here we can adjust our exposure a bit, maybe lower our pre-contrast a tad bit more, and adjust our post-contrast. And then let's take a look at this scaled up and compare to our Rec 709 version, and you can see how much the emulation is doing, especially to the wood and her skin tone. It's really bringing out those subtractive reds and just the general richness there. You can see our lifted shadows. We've still got our blues here, and then our white point is staying relatively neutral and balanced. So let's minimize this, and I'll just talk about this adjustment real quick, which is our post-contrast node. So this allows you to clean up your black point if you don't want your shadows to be too lifted, and it's just easier to do that with a linear contrast adjustment here instead of these contrast adjustments, which are S-curves, because that is the default in Resolve. So if we enlarge this and just toggle on that post-contrast adjustment, you can see that's just adding a bit of linear contrast just to give us a slightly punchier, cleaner look. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. Let's try the print output, and this is again a little bit more contrasty compared to the Cineon output, and we'll also probably have to add a little bit more green in there, and I'll increase exposure just a tad bit more, and let's take a look at that. So here's our print output, and actually right now this is with our post contrast. I'll disable that. So here's our print output without the post contrast. So we've got our lifted shadows here, just a very classic iconic print look. You've got those lifted shadows, the warm cool color contrast happening here. but our white point still feels pretty neutral and balanced, and skin tones feel natural as well. So let me minimize that. I'll just turn on our post contrast, and you can see that's just giving us a bit more linear contrast and cleaning up those shadows. Okay, I'd say I'm happy with that as a final look. Let's move on to our next clip. Alright, so with this clip we can also copy our grade over, because this is again Alexa footage. These other three clips coming up though are different. We've got Blackmagic Pocket footage and some GH5 footage, so I will show some other cameras here. So with this clip we'll definitely have to reset our white balance, and then I'll definitely lower this exposure here. Maybe for this one we'll do the warmer white point, so I'll show that here. We just open up our compound node, switch to the D55, so this is 5500 Kelvin white point, so we've just made it a little bit warmer here. And the main thing I'm going to talk about in this clip is the halation, because the halation in version 2 has been improved a lot. But before I talk about that, I'll just make a few other adjustments here. I think we can still warm this clip up a little bit, maybe to there. I'd say white balance wise, this looks pretty good. Maybe I'll just do some slight contrast tweaks. We'll just lower that a little bit, and then maybe increase this a tad. I'd say grain is also looking pretty good. So let's talk about the halation here. If I zoom in and we take a look at the halation and just the whole highlight region closely, actually maybe I'll even scale it up to here. If we turn our halation on and off, you can see that the halation really is only the edges, whereas previously the halation was tinting the entire highlight region. So this part of the sky and this part of the sky would have been affected, but now the halation truly is just the edges. So that is a big improvement. Another thing is that the placement of the halation within the order of operations of the node tree has been improved so that it interacts more accurately with other aspects of the image. So for example, if I zoom in on the halation here and turn it on and off, you can see that the halation is now under the grain. The grain is embedded in the halation, whereas previously the halation was being applied on top of the grain, and this just is not accurate and did not look correct. So that has been improved. Another thing is that the halation is placed after the exposure but before our contrast node. So you can adjust your exposure and the halation will react realistically to the intensity levels of the image. But since the pre-contrast node is happening after the halation, you can adjust your contrast freely without affecting your halation. There are circumstances though where you might want to have your pre-contrast affect your halation. So in those cases you could just add another node or just move this over. So now I will size this to fit, and then I'll show this other exciting new feature. If we turn this on, you can see we now have a film border as part of the node tree. So this is a nice new feature in version 2. We've got two different film border mats for 4:3 and 16:9. And if you're shooting in any other aspect ratio, you can adjust the width and height to fit your project. So what I'll show here is that if we click through this clip a bit, you can see that the halation reacts accordingly to the light on the edges of the frame. So if I zoom in here, and I click through, you can see the halation is changing along the border. And if I minimize this and go to the exposure node once again, let's turn this really far down, and then I'll enlarge the image again. If I turn that exposure node on and off, you can see how the halation is again reacting accordingly with the exposure along the border of the image. And I'll zoom in over here so you can see that better. And here it is in the top. So that's a really nice new feature. Let's increase our exposure again to about where it was. Now here is what it looks like if I isolate just the halation key. You can see that the halation truly is only affecting the borders and not the entire highlight region. The brightest specular highlights are the strongest in terms of the halation, and then they kind of ease out into the lower stops of the highlight dynamic range. So that's looking pretty good for our print output. If I click through our clip here, you can see some of the other parts of the clip. It's all looking pretty good. What I'll do here though is compare with our Rec 709 image. So this is just the log C outputting to Rec 709 again through a CST, and you can see how much the emulation is doing with the tonality of the image, the color response, the halation. We've got our nice film border now. There's a lot of characteristics being added that culminate in this print film look that feels very accurate. So let's minimize this, and I'll go over to our Cineon look real quick and we can check that out. Again, we'll compare that to our Rec 709, and here you can see how much the Cineon look is retaining a lot of that color information in the highlights, especially if I zoom in on the skyline back here. Our Rec 709 look is pretty washed out in the highlights. Obviously you could grade that and change that, but our Cineon film look is looking very nice and filmic in the highlight roll-off. I'll also click through the rest of the clip here so you can see how these other images look. Still very filmic. So I'd say this is good for our Cineon film look. Let's move on to our next clip.